Hello, everybody. This is Tuesday Morning Grind, episode number 27. Today we have Jeremy Garcia with us. Jeremy is the founder of LinuxQuestionsorg, which is a really big community that a lot of the listeners are probably familiar with. Big in the open source community, the Linux community, and also you have your own podcast, Bad Voltage, and you're currently a director at Datadog too, which is pretty cool. And we'll talk a little bit about some of that. So welcome and thank you for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So, the first thing I wanted to address and kind of dive into is the Linux questions stuff, because at least that's how I knew who you were when we were introduced. So can you talk about how did you get involved with that, and then some of the logistics behind managing a community of that size, that kind of thing?
Yeah, sure, absolutely. So I had just gotten my first full-time Linux job, and I was really, really excited about it, and I wanted to give something back to the community that I felt had really given me a lot. So started the site, and it's funny, I remember thinking when I started it, wow, if I could ever just get 100 people to be members, that would be really, really cool. Now in between 10 and 15 million people a month come to the site still, which despite Facebook and social networks and Reddit and everything else, the site still manages to be immensely popular. To be frank, more popular than I would have anticipated at this point, certainly. So has definitely far exceeded any expectations that I ever had, but it's been a super fun journey and continues to be super interesting.
How did you grow such a community? Was it just when you started it? I don't know if you pictured it into growing into some large community at all, but did you do anything along the way, or was it just time and place? People needed that information.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I wasn't aware of a couple other Linux forums that were already around. I checked a little bit. Google wasn't quite as good then, and I started it, like I said, I thought maybe someday I'd have 100 members. It started becoming a little bit popular, and I got the opportunity to exhibit at Linux World. So that was a very large conference that used to be in New York City at Javits. They invited 10 at the time nonprofits out in what they called the .org pavilion. So, Red Hat and Oracle had the big traditional booths, and then they had this little area where they wanted to be kind of more open source focused. Got to exhibit there, and it was amazing. At that point, I think we only had 5 moderators, and 3 of them flew out. One of them flew out from England on their own dime. It's not like we had a budget. We weren't an organization. It was 100% volunteer and still is. And just having that energy and seeing people in the booth and having person after person come up and say, oh, I wouldn't be using Linux if it wasn't for the site, was, I think, really one of the more energizing parts about the site's history. Linus came to the booth and he was familiar with the site. I remember that being kind of cool. And I think those types of things, we did that a couple times. We ended up at Linux World UK, then we ended up at Linux World in San Francisco. And oddly, I think that in-person experience spread the word even more, and then from there the site just grew. It went from thousands of visitors of 1 month to millions of visitors a month pretty quickly, and then from there it kind of topped out in the tens of millions is where it is now.
How many people outside of yourself manage the site? Like a lot of volunteers, or what's the logistics behind that?
Yeah, so as far as the infrastructure and all that is just me. Coding is just me, and then for moderators we have about 22 to 24 depending on, it is 100% volunteer. It's a surprising amount of work for volunteer work, so they people come and go as you would expect over the course of many years, but there's a little over 20 at all times.
It makes sense that the LinuxQuestions.org would be ran by volunteers. That's kind of the open source spirit, so I like that. Did you have so Linux is open source, and I've seen you do some talks on open source and that kind of thing. How did you get into that whole world? Was that something you stumbled in, or was it something you're passionate about early on?
Yeah, it was. For most of my life, just technology and computers have also always fascinated me. And I worked at an ISP when I was in high school, and they used a proprietary Unix, and I wanted to use something similar at home. I didn't want to use Windows or Mac, and Mac really wasn't as good as it is now, to be honest. And the Unix they used, because it was proprietary, was outrageously expensive, many thousands of dollars per license, just something I couldn't afford at home, especially at the time. So stumbled upon Linux, started using it, and I thought it wasn't only super cool that this big proprietary system that they used at an ISP I could run at my house, but also that I could see the code, I could modify the code, I could change things, and really that's how I started to learn to code, was looking at Linux kernel code and other things. So it was such an interesting thing to me. So that's really how I got into open source, and then started managing some open source projects and became a contributor to some open source projects. And then just the ethos of learning and sharing and collaborating, and the ability to stand on the shoulders of giants just was something that was fascinating, both from a technology perspective, but also with that human perspective is to me just as interesting.
Yeah, there's always a conversation in the security community about the security of closed systems versus open source systems. Where do you stand on that? Do you think open source is inherently more secure, less secure, has the potential to be as much secure? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the hiding behind the security through obscurity thing, just especially these days, is not a thing that's going to happen, right? Someone, even if they don't have access to the code, there's either really good tooling out there to, in effect, have access to the code, but also just the people are smart and intelligent, and they're going to poke at holes, and whether they have access to the code or not, they're going to find vulnerabilities that exist. So the ability for others to see it and audit it, I think, from a risk perspective, but also from a security perspective, open source is always going to just have an edge there.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I think a lot about is privacy, because when you think about like what the social media companies are doing, what every corporation is trying to do is, in the closed system, is like you don't really know. Like there's some sense of I don't know what they're gathering, I don't know what they're doing with the data. But with the open source community, there's an opportunity to at least inspect, or at least someone smarter than me is going to look at it and let us all know that that something's going on.
Yeah, just that transparency. So developers of open source systems know people will look, which will disincent them from doing some of those things. But just that transparency and auditability, I think, from a risk compliance perspective, is super big.
Yeah, where do you stand on? What's your thoughts on the whole privacy world? I listened to Bad Voltage. You guys have some stuff on privacy, and everybody should check that out if they haven't already. But what's your take on all this stuff when it comes to like social media, privacy? Some of the controversy we're seeing. There's the Amazon sidewalk thing that just opened up, where they're going to let, passerbys get access to your internet.
Yeah, that was interesting. So yeah, we do talk about privacy a lot on Bad Voltage. So badvoltage.org if you're interested. That's every other week. So I mean, I think I am a very pro-privacy person. I am a private person, but also think privacy is important, and something that people don't realize to what extent technology erodes privacy if you let it. The defaults a lot of times, and Amazon Sidewalk is a great example. Like they just opted in years after you bought a device to a thing that didn't even exist when they shipped it, in a way that is not only weird from a privacy perspective, and I get that everything's encrypted. I understand it's a separate network. It's very low bandwidth. Like from a technology perspective, I get what Sidewalk is, but I think the fact that Amazon, who makes so much money, would put their reputation at risk for something like that is indicative of where companies are today, and it's a little bit scary to me. Yeah,
there is something about, and I don't want to assume malicious intent or anything like that, but it's kind of like they're testing the boundaries. You give it a shot. Will people, are they down with this or are they not? Because I can certainly say for myself, I didn't find out from Amazon that they were doing that. I found out from like a LinkedIn post or something.
Yeah, I didn't find out from Amazon. I don't know that they even sent notification.
Me either. I don't know how it. Really, the origins of it. I've just been hearing.
I don't have an echo, but I definitely found out through news organizations, not through Amazon.
So what about your your personal privacy ecosystem? Is there anything that you do to like protect your own privacy in terms of like cell phone usage or social media sites, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, so I do have a social media account for Linux questions more than anything. Like for Facebook, I don't use it personally. I do use Twitter both personally and professionally. I probably skew more privacy conscious than most people. So I have a Pixel, which is, if you're going to go into the Android ecosystem, probably the most secure phone. I know many ardent iOS fans would say that nothing is secure as iOS, but like I said, in the Android ecosystem, if you care about security, I think Pixel's the way to go. Even like the home network, I do have a couple IoT devices. I think they're interesting. I have them on a separate network that is completely walled off from any of my actual PCs, which I think everyone should do. I don't know that everyone is technical enough to do so, but like this. The house here has 3 networks, one that's like a guest network if you come over, one that has all my things, and then one that is just IoT devices. And none of them can talk. So I think anytime it's about the same thing as with security, right? It's about in-depth defenses. So I look at privacy the same way as I look at security when I'm trying to defend infrastructure. Yeah,
you mentioned earlier that like technology has the potential to erode privacy, and there's some consequences of that. And for me, one of the things, there's books on this, not to get too obscure, but like the mere act of observation changes behavior. There's some of that. Have you thought about, or what do you think some of the consequences, or what are some of the concerns you have in the privacy space about just like the degradation of privacy?
So it's funny that you say just the observation changes behaviors. One thing that fascinates me today is I have the assumption that if I'm not in my home, I'm on a camera somewhere, probably multiple cameras, probably owned by multiple people, certainly one of which is probably accessible to X amount of agencies, be they government, non-government, whatever it is. The behavior that you see in public, despite that, is a little bit surprising to me sometimes. But yeah, I mean, we live in a world realistically, even in the United States, but even more so if you go to places like the UK, especially London. Like London, you can't go 3 feet without being on 7 CCTV cameras.
Well, there's like the Ring doorbell, which people forget about. Those are everywhere now.
Rings are absolutely everywhere. So it's just surprising that I think it's just a little bit of a weird feeling to know that if you're outside, you're on, like I said, X amount of cameras. And it's not just, so Ring has access to your data, which means Amazon has access to it, but they also have that neighbors program. So potentially authorities have access to it. Who knows who made that chip? Do they have access to it? And then there's a bunch of different manufacturers. So realistically, the number of cohorts that have access to that data is almost unknowable. And the number of devices is increasing daily.
Yeah, one of the people or actually a couple of people I've had the opportunity to talk to on this podcast were like in Cyber Command or some other aspect of military services in cybersecurity. And the theme that has come up again and again, specific to the U.S., is the corporate military partnerships. Whereas like if you go to China, it's well known that China will surveil their own citizens pretty openly. But in the U.S., there's this idea that the government's not surveilling their own citizen. They have a surveillance apparatus for the rest of the world, but not as much on their own citizens. But they'll openly admit the way they get around that is really strong corporate partnerships. So like the Facebooks, the Amazons, the Google of the world, you must presume are providing data, which is almost more scary because there's like a level of abstraction there and less accountability for all that. So I was wondering in the back of my head, and when I was thinking about you and the open source versus closed ecosystems, like that just kept coming back to me, this really important aspect of privacy and security and some of the advantages of open source.
Yeah. The one other thing that's been surprising to me over the years is getting people to care about privacy is very difficult. And you see, it's funny to me, Apple has made their whole marketing like we give you more privacy, even though in a lot of ways they don't. They've made it their brand. And I hope maybe they get you to care about privacy. I really think Mozilla is a great example of Firefox differentiator should have been privacy all along, and it clearly wasn't, and that's disappointing. But if you're listening and you don't care about privacy, think about it deeply and maybe care a little bit more. Like checking a couple boxes will make your life very, very slightly more difficult or a little bit more of a hassle. But if everyone checks those boxes, I think technology would just be in a much better place.
I almost wonder if it's like a bit of just ignorance, and I don't mean that in an insulting way, just literally people don't know. Like, for example, one thing, I knew this, but it wasn't in the forefront of my mind, that Firefox does is when you go from one website to another, the ISP knows where you came from, where you're going, for example. And I think one of the features that Firefox did, if I'm not mistaken, is adding a level of abstraction there where maybe the ISP can't see all of your traffic, where you're coming and going from. And that's a pretty big deal, because if you can get access to someone's browsing history and like their name, you could probably figure out all sorts of things. Political affiliation, probably you can guess their net worth. You can probably guess what they're into. And that's a hugely powerful thing.
It is. I mean, that's the problem Flock is also somewhat trying to address, which is Google's new, now that third-party cookies are going away, their response to it. And it's when you realize what cohort you are in is so specific, it's a little scary.
Yeah, it really is. Have you ever heard of the wisdom of the crowds thing that some of the Google searches have done, where they can like predict like stuff like flu season, because they can look at aggregated search results and be like, oh, we must be on the cusp of flu season, just because the net averages look out.
When you have access to that much data, it's surprising what you can glean out of it, for sure.
Yeah, I'm always worried because they don't tell you. Like, they don't publish many reports on their cool findings from all the search results. And I'm like, they must know way more than we can imagine through like email and everything else.
Yeah, I'm sure.
So I know you do a little bit of open source work at Datadog too. So and I don't know how much you can talk about this, but Datadog's a really cool company. I like them a lot. Can you talk about like maybe even if it's not Datadog specific, like what's the role of positions like yours when you're doing open source stuff at companies like Datadog or elsewhere?
Yeah, absolutely. So before I worked at Datadog, I ran a consultancy where we did half building sustainable open source communities and then half kind of helping companies build open source business models and things of that nature. So what I do at Datadog, I'm the director of technical community and open source. So that means I started their open source programs office, but I also run the docs team, the developer advocacy team, the training team. So basically anywhere engineering interfaces with communications typically is going to be on the team. So from an open source perspective, a lot of the things that we talked about directly applied to Datadog. So all of our agents are open source, all of our SDKs are open source, all of our libraries are open source. Basically, anything that runs on your infrastructure is going to be open source. And one of the main reasons for that is because you're shipping logs, you're shipping us a lot of data, you should be able to verify that we are saying what we do is correct, and we're not doing anything we say we're not doing when we're doing everything we say we're doing, and you could look at our agent and verify that that is always the case. It's also, we integrate with almost 450 different solutions, but there's always going to be one we don't integrate with. Even when we integrate with 550, there'll be one we don't integrate with that you're using. So the ability for you to write your own integrations and submit data as part of the agent is something that a lot of our, especially larger customers do, and open source enables that. So it's partially about, again, standing on the shoulders of giants and building on top of the things that we're already building. And especially as we pivot to become not just an observability product, but a platform that you can build on top of, kind of being open source in that regard is table stakes, right? But then there's also that privacy side and auditability compliance side as well. So we think open source is important for both.
So one of the really cool things from an outsider's perspective about your career is that it appears that you've built a career on being an open source advocate and guru and expert. And when I talk to my engineering team at Risk360, like one of their goals is always to contribute something to the open source or to make an impact, put something out there that the world's using. So I can always sense in the building community, like there's some desire to contribute. Can you talk about like our company? Did you land at companies like Datadog because of your expertise? Did they seek you out? Are you applying to jobs? How do you build a career in being an open source guru? Or is it highly specialized to you because of your background?
No, I mean, I don't think it's highly specialized to me in any way. I think one thing for me that was always important is understanding where business value and open source intersect, and then understanding how to help organizations drive their business value through open source. Because I think open source is great for a lot of reasons, right? It's about the collaboration. It's almost one of those weird questions when some people ask, like, well, why does open source matter? And the first thing I always ask is, matter to whom? Because it matters in so many different ways that's such a long conversation if you don't narrow it down. So it's, like I said, it's about the ability to learn and the ability to share. But if you're an organization, it's about avoiding having to build everything from the ground up, which saves you tough time and money, and it allows you to focus on the things that are your core competencies. So I'm a big believer that you want to commoditize your complements. So if it isn't your core business and your core IP, making it open is going to allow you to drive the cost of doing that down and drive the value of what you're actually doing up, which is obviously, as an organization, if you are part of the capitalist world, is something that you want to do. So helping businesses understand why open source is important is a lot of, I think, why I've been successful.
Do you think that from your experience, are a lot of organizations looking for people like yourself or others that are highly interested in open source? Or obviously the answer is yes, everybody wants a developer that knows how to navigate open source, but what about the aspect of like building communities, like open source APIs? Is that a trend that you're seeing, or it is well established? It
very much is. I think it's a trend that was accelerating quickly, and I'm just seeing the velocity continue to go up. I think it's important for a couple of reasons. More and more, everything really, you're a recruiting company, regardless of if you're in technology, you are a recruiting company. It's so many large tech companies are recruiting at such an unbelievable pace that competing with them becomes difficult. And if you're not willing to participate in open source ecosystems, you're going to immediately lose good candidates, and good engineers build interesting things and have interesting ideas. So it starts to double down and just, from there it almost grows exponentially. So if you're not in that open source game, it makes recruiting really, really difficult. So you're going to have to make up for that another way. Maybe it's paying way above market, but that introduces other problems. So I see a lot of open source also as just recruiting. It allows you to help mentor junior folks, but it also allows you to again, recruiting is difficult, and I think it's become obvious that a lot of the interview process in tech isn't great. If you hire someone out of the open source ecosystem that you can see how they interact with other humans, you can see the quality of their code, you can see so many things that indicate whether someone will be successful in a role, that it's almost the majority of the interview process can be part of that open source participation.
Yep. Yeah, when we hire engineers, we almost always look for a portfolio. I say almost always. I think the answer is always. Like, I can't remember an engineer that's come through that we haven't kind of looked at the portfolio, talked about what they're interested in developing.
Yep.
And if you see a person that's like really made an effort to contribute and do something kind of neat, you know they're going to be great. So to your point, that's true. What about like emerging tech? So we hear buzzwords like machine learning and artificial intelligence. There's blockchain stuff. I'm very interested in I guess, decentralization and blockchain from a security and privacy perspective, which we could talk about. But any like emerging tech in the open source community that just has your attention or that you're interested in?
I mean, yeah, I think you covered all of the buzzwords that are at least popular right now. I think ML is genuinely interesting. Artificial intelligence, I have my doubts on whether we'll get there, but I think there's so many cool things you can do with ML today that worrying about where we are tomorrow almost isn't necessary. There's so many cool problems to tackle today that you can worry about tomorrow. I think blockchain is also super interesting, both from, crypto is obviously super popular right now, but I think there are a lot of non-crypto use cases for blockchain that could be potentially compelling. I know, I think when you're looking at new technologies, and you just mentioned quite a few, open source is part of every single one of them. It's almost difficult to find a technology today that is trending up, and open source is not a huge, almost foundational component of.
Yeah, I like some of the social media platforms that allow you to integrate with each other. There's a specific word that's escaping me right now, but you'll see like Federation, thank you, like Mastodon and others. And allows for a little bit more privacy. A lot of them are open source, so you can kind of see what's happening with your data on the back end somewhat. Or you can start your own social media platform, which is kind of cool, and then federate with your buddies. Are you aware of like any other cool like open source projects like that are going on, or how are you tracking that? Or do you know?
I mean, there's a bunch, like Matrix is really popular in that space. There's a bunch of competitors to Slack that are open source. Mattermost probably being the most popular. I think it's interesting to me in that in those particular spaces, for whatever reason, federated products have not caught on in the way that centralized apps have. Like Slack is the most popular communications channel, more so than the open source ones. I think that it would not surprise me at some point if that does change. I think a lot of it has been the compliance piece is tough, because if you're talking about something like Slack, so much of what your company does happens in Slack that you really want peace of mind to know that it's going to be retained in a way that is durable and safe for your use case. But I think medium term, I'm not even talking long term here, medium term, I could see some of these federated, more open source standards taking over on the communication side.
Yeah, I don't know what the gap is. It's harder, I guess. I mean, my family uses Slack. We have like a family Slack app, and there's people of all ages and technology acumen using it. So there's just some benefit to it being very easy. But also, it's not that hard to spin up a federated instance and host it yourself either.
And you only need one technical person, right? They're not much harder to use from a user's perspective. There's usually just the setup, which only takes a small percentage of the people actually using it.
What do you think about, there has been this trend, I guess, for the last decade or so to centralize, for example, a data center or a cloud storage and hosting through something like AWS or GCP or what have you. And then there's some emerging technology around being able to do like peer-to-peer sharing through blockchain or crypto, at least incentives. Are you interested in any of that stuff? Do you think that stuff has legs or pipe dream?
I'm only into it at a cursory level. I try to keep an eye on technology in general, just when things come out. So like there's that new domain name that's only on the blockchain. That I think like one major, it might be Opera supports it, but Firefox and Chrome don't yet. I'm not sure that blockchain hosting will catch on anytime soon. Most blockchains aren't even really set up for large data transfer. But I think portions of what we do could be moved to things that are similar to blockchains. But I would imagine that the major clouds for the foreseeable future are the answer here.
I want to learn, like, what is can you talk a little, and I'll do this off night, can you talk a little bit about some of the projects that you're working on at Datadog in terms of like are there any things you'd like to talk through there?
I mean, Datadog, I've been there 4 years, and it's unbelievable that the progress as an organization that we've made. When I started, we basically only did infrastructure, and APM was in beta, and now we do so many things that it would take too long to even go through them all. But we truly are a platform that is observability from beginning to end, from front end to back end. And I think what really differentiates us and makes it exciting is it's a single pane of glass, and I was on call for a large portion of my career, and having the ability to do what Datadog did would have made my life so much better. That part of what I love about the product is I wish that it existed then, because I think we're making on-call better. I think we're just making engineers' lives better in general, and that's super, super exciting to me.
Yeah. How big is your team, or how big are the teams you work with?
I mean, the community team overall is like 20 different people.
So are you the in charge of like hiring and developing those team, or where do you sit as far as that organization?
I am. Yep, I'm in charge of hiring and building the teams up.
So what's your process like, shifting gears and kind of like a leadership thing? Because I think managing a group of engineers is distinct, and I imagine even open source in the community that you're building is distinctly different than, say, building other types of team. How do you go about finding talent? What's your process there?
I mean, as I said, recruiting is difficult, and I think one of my major roles within the organization now is recruiting good people and then retaining those good people, and it's tough. I mean, there's a lot of awesome organizations out there to work for. I think we are one, and encourage you to apply if you're looking for a position. Happy to chat, but be it on my team or not on my team. But I think one thing that I really like about the organization is we're about trust and honesty and authenticity in a way that not every organization has the opportunity to be. The two founders are still with the organization, and they genuinely care. They care about people, they care about succeeding, they care about technology. And that culture has just permeated the entire organization in a way that is super fun, it's super engaging. Like I said, I've been there over 4 years and still really enjoy it and look forward to it every day.
How do you know when you're interviewing someone that like you spotted a good candidate? Are there like attributes you're looking for or anything like that?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it depends on which team we're talking about, but to me, so I have a couple people from the team would interview them before they got to me, so would already have a pretty good idea, I think, of strong candidates. But I like to talk about what gets people excited, what engineering projects they're working on, what engineering projects they have worked on and have been excited about, but also what they want to learn about next. And usually there's that spark in someone's eye when they start talking about something that they're really interested in, and that's when you know, like, they really care about this, they're really interested, they're really good at it, and that's a lot of what I care about. Yeah.
Is it, when you're developing people and things like that, is it exclusively like engineering based, or can you talk about your team setup a little bit? Is a lot of engineers, a lot of people managing the community? What does that look like? Like, what does managing the community mean for you guys?
Yeah, so I mean, again, it's going to depend on which team. So for the advocacy team, for example, we want really strong engineers that have great communication skills, because they're helping other engineers build, they're helping other engineers succeed, they're helping other engineers understand what observability is, why it's important, why you should care about it. So I think one of the things we look for on that team, and actually through all the teams that report through community, is really, really strong communication skills. I think in engineering in general, communication skills are way, way misunderstood and underrepresented. Like, the engineers that you see get ahead typically have very good communication skills, regardless of what kind of organization that they're in. Knowing that you're correct is one thing, or thinking you're correct is one thing. Being able to help other engineers, be it junior, be it more senior than you, less senior than you, it doesn't matter. Helping them understand why you're correct is so important in engineering and so underappreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. We see the same thing. Like in security, there's this thought that there's a huge talent shortage, and there arguably is, but you could probably say the same about engineering or any other group. But finding senior individuals that really want to coach and train up other younger talent is like a huge gap, because it seems like people learn all the technical skills earlier in their career, how to be a great engineer, how to be a great security practitioner. Then they get promoted to manager, and there's like the Peter principle, where you don't know how to be a good leader or coach, but you are a great tacticianer. So it's just an interesting phenomena there.
There is. I mean, it's actually one thing I'm very deliberate about and have been throughout my career and have seen it go the other way is you should never be forced into management. Because you're a good engineer doesn't mean that you are interested in becoming a manager or will be good at being a manager. I try to convince people that going into management is not a promotion in any way, shape, or form. It's a career change, and you should treat it as a career change. So that's another thing that I think is way underappreciated in our industry in general.
What do you like more? Do you like the management aspect or do you like the technical aspect more yourself?
I genuinely love both. Like I said, technology has always fascinated me. It continues to fascinate me. I continue to probably, to be frank, have too much IC work because I genuinely enjoy it and want to stay close to the technology. But it's funny because on the technology side, when you're an IC, there's a project you have to deliver or something you have to do or something you have to get to work. And once you do it, it's done. So there's a moment where it's completed and you have that great feeling or catharsis, depending on if it was an outage or whatever it was. Where in management, it's super fuzzy and it's never done. But mentoring someone to be successful, I don't know that there's anything more satisfying at all.
What about on the non-work side? Are you still kind of, where is all of your open source projects like Linux Questions and others? Are there anything outside of that you're actively working on, like kind of personal projects?
So I contribute less code than I used to, just because between Datadog and Bad Voltage, I'm on the board of the Linux Fund. I do a whole bunch of other things. I still try to write where I can. I just don't have as much time as I used to. But I'll submit a bug fix here and there where I can. For me, it's more on the usage side. So I try to migrate LQ, while I probably shouldn't, every year or two, just to something new so that I can understand it. So right now it's on GKE, because I'm interested in Kubernetes. So try to stay super close to the technology through LQ in a lot of ways.
Yeah. Not to diminish the huge contributions that you've made, because you're managing a very large community and a rapidly growing organization as well. What about, thanks to you, for being here and for spending some time to talk through it. If people want to get in touch with you, either at Datadog or through Linux Questions, what's the best way that people can reach out to you?
Yeah, so I mean, you can email me at jeremy@linuxquestions.org. At Linux Questions on Twitter, so super easy to find there as well. So those are probably the two easiest places.
And then they can find your podcasts, Bad Voltage, all the podcast apps.
Yep,
awesome.
Exactly.
Excellent. Cool. Well, thank you for joining. If you guys like content like this, you can look for Tuesday Morning Grind on any of the podcast apps. You can search for Risk 360 on YouTube and check out our playlist around Tuesday Morning Grind. We always talk to cool folks like Jeremy who are doing interesting things in the security community and the technology space. So, Jeremy, thank you very much for giving me a little bit of your time today.
You got it. Thanks again for having me.
Absolutely.